In 1803, Meriwether Lewis left Pittsburgh by boat, commissioned to explore, map, and describe what he encountered. His journals were the first written documentation of wildlife from the American West. 220 years later, it's time for a wildlife resurvey.
I'm Roland Case, a biologist with the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences and North Carolina State University. We're retracing the Lewis and Clark route, not to see the scenery, but to do science. We're comparing the animals they noted 220 years ago with what we find today. We started our survey on a farm outside of Pittsburgh, and what we found tells a remarkable story about loss, recovery, and what happens when a country decides to invest in its wildlife. This farm was a working dairy for 150 years. By the time Mitch Barkowski bought it in 1999, it had been sitting empty for 2 decades, and that suited him just fine.
I grew up hunting on an apple orchard just north of Pittsburgh that has turned into a housing community. And it was probably one of the best hunting spots I've ever been. And I kind of got the sense that if I don't buy a place of my own, everywhere I grew up hunting has turned into houses. My dad always wanted a farm, but I bought the place so that my kid would always have a place to come rabbit hunting and come run the dogs and just get away from the city and get out in the country and get out in the wildlife.
For Mitch, the whole point of the farm is wildlife.
Look, I bought the place primarily to hunt rabbits. And so what we do is create an rabbitat. We called it rabbitat, right? So you'd have a long strip of a brush pile for cover and then plant a field with grass so you'd have cover and feed and give them everything they need.
But managing the land for rabbits also creates spaces for all kinds of other species. This pattern, taking action to save game species that also broadly benefits biodiversity, is one of the engines of conservation in North America. We placed our camera traps at Mitch's place in January as part of a network of over 120 scientists running cameras across the country in collaboration with the Smithsonian. Together, we're building a picture of where wildlife is today across America. Camera traps are motion-sensitive sensors that run 24/7 and capture pictures of any animals that walk by. Ours were active for 5 months. In January, we were walking across frozen fields to set them. When we came back in May to collect the data, the landscape had completely changed. This is the Smithsonian and North Carolina Museum working together right here, baby.
When Lewis traveled through this region, he started documenting wildlife. He saw gray squirrels crossing the Ohio River by the thousands, flocks of passenger pigeons so dense they darkened the sky. But by 1803, the big animals were already in decline. Through the 1800s, there was no such thing as bag limits, no hunting seasons, no protected areas. People just hunted and trapped whatever they could get. By the turn of the century, beaver and fisher were gone from the region, and deer survived only in the most remote corners. The passenger pigeons Lewis described here, once the most abundant bird in North America, went completely extinct in the early 1900s. By this time, many Americans had accepted that fisher, beaver, and dozens of other hunted species were simply going to disappear, the way the pigeon had. To turn things around, the country had to invent the science of wildlife management, the concept of a protected area, the practice of rewilding lost species. And it worked. Let's check the cameras.
We'll start with deer. By 1906, the Game Commission had started restocking, purchasing animals from other states and releasing them across Pennsylvania. It was one of the first large-scale wildlife reintroductions in history, funded by public money. The deer started to recover, but slowly. Even into the mid-20th century, harvesting a deer was something you worked hard for.
When my dad or my pap would come home and he'd have a deer strapped on the fender of his car, it was a big event. It was special, right? They were, my pap farmed and he worked in the steel mill at night. He farmed by day, and that meat in the freezer meant something to him. And nowadays we take for granted. There's not a year that goes by that if I want to shoot a deer, I have no doubt in my mind that I can go out, get a doe tag, and put meat in my freezer.
3 generations. That's all it took to go from a deer on the fender being a family event to seeing them out the window every day. But this didn't happen by accident. It happened because wildlife managers learned to use hunting itself as a tool. Chris Rhoda at West Virginia University studies exactly how this works. Dr. Rhoda runs his own camera trap network here, tracking how wildlife populations respond to land management. He's also a deer hunter, which means he thinks about these questions from both sides of the equation.
Early deer management was buck only, right? And then as populations started to increase, you started to be able to harvest does. And so when you start to have management that's aimed at removing more does from the population, that's when your objectives are to shrink the herd.
That's science. When to protect, when to harvest, how many animals a landscape can hold. This was invented in America in the early 20th century, and this foundational research was paid for, in a large part, by the hunters themselves.
When hunters buy rifles, ammunition, there's an excise tax. And then the Fish and Wildlife Service has a formula that they use to reallocate those funds back to the states. It's not just the deer that benefit, right? Just by the virtue of having that land that is off limit to development, it will protect all of the animals that use those lands.
The deer recovery is remarkable, but this next story might be even more so, because most people have never even heard of a fisher. It's a large member of the weasel family, a predator of northern forest, and its valuable fur made it a prized target.
There was fur prices I was reading were close to $300 a pelt. That in conjunction with habitat loss, we really logged the state over pretty well.
The fisher recovery began in 1969 with a government program that most people had never heard of.
23 fisher were introduced in West Virginia, and they were all from New Hampshire. From those 23, we now have a current estimated population of, the DNR says 1,000 to 2,000 fisher in the state.
The animal reintroduction worked because we also allowed the forest to recover.
We're the third most forested state in the country, and the amount of forest that we have in West Virginia is increasing, and it's getting older.
The public lands created refuges for wildlife, but they only cover so much ground. The spaces between them also matter.
And the Monongahela National Forest is relatively big, but we've got postage stamps of protected areas, state parks, wildlife management areas, and a lot of the private lands conservations, I think, serve to fill in the gaps.
Fishers are also recovered in Pennsylvania, but they're secretive and largely nocturnal. Even experienced naturalists rarely see them. This is exactly where camera traps earn their keep.
Yeah, I've never seen a fisher on the property.
But that's not surprising. Fishers have only recently recolonized as part of Pennsylvania. But our cameras caught them at Chris's site in West Virginia and here on Mitch's farm, proof that the recovery is still spreading. Deer and fisher are the headline stories here, but the same arc, collapse, public investment, recovery, shows up with almost every species our cameras record. Take beavers. By the mid-1800s, trapped to near extinction across Pennsylvania. Reintroduction in 1917 led to a recovery, and the Game Commission eventually reopened sustainable trapping seasons. And today, beavers are engineering wetlands across the state, reshaping streams and creating habitat that many other species depend on. Sandhill cranes follow the same storyline, but with a twist. These are large, loud birds of open country. Hunters used to call them ribeye of the sky, and they were easy targets. By the mid-1800s, they'd been hunted out of Pennsylvania entirely. Lewis noted cranes later in his journal, but never reported them here. But the cranes came back on their own. Once hunting laws gave them protection and habitat stabilized, they recolonized naturally.
About 15 years ago, we started getting sandhill cranes here at the property, and at this point, we've had nesting pairs for 12, 15 years now. It's just, there's almost not a trip up that I don't see sandhills anymore.
What we're seeing on these cameras, sandhill cranes nesting in Pennsylvania, fishers moving through forests they disappeared from a century ago, beavers reshaping stream systems, deer so abundant, Mitch sees them every day. This is the North American wildlife conservation miracle. It has been driven by public investment in science, reintroductions, and protected areas. Hunters funding their own regulation, private landowners and land conservancies filling in the gaps. It works.
It's pretty amazing how nature, you give it a chance and it just seems to know what to do.
The miracle isn't over, but it needs people behind it. Buy a hunting or fishing license, even if you never plan to use it. Visit a national forest or state park. Support a land conservancy or even donate your land to one. The funding model that brought these animals back still depends on all of us participating in it. Next up, The expedition heads to St. Louis, where wildlife doesn't retreat from the city, it moves in.